On August 2, 1939, President Franklin Roosevelt had received a letter from Leo Szilard, a Hungarian physicist, and signed by Albert Einstein, warning the U.S. of Germany making progress towards the goal of possessing atomic weapons. Szilard urged President Roosevelt to start a nuclear program in the United States to develop nuclear weapons before the Germans. During the mid-1940s, the Second World War was coming to an end, and the United States tried to enforce unconditional surrender on the Japanese and failed. This led to President Truman compromising with his advisors and using the new atomic bomb, creating a global conflict on the atomic potential. This changed modern warfare and sparked the arms race of the Cold War. In response to the warning from Leo Szilard, President Roosevelt had started the United States' own nuclear program called the Manhattan Project, with General Leslie Groves as the lead military officer and Robert Oppenheimer as the lead physicist. This had become one of the largest projects in the history of the United States at the time and reached a peak of 130,000 employees in the developing of the most expensive weapon of the war. The Manhattan Project was so large and tedious that it was estimated the project consumed roughly 10% of all electricity that was produced in the United States. The Manhattan Project had extended over a course of 3 years to develop weapons-grade uranium and to develop the right process on how to detonate the bomb and get the most destruction out of it as possible. The Trinity test was the first nuclear detonation in history, and the United States had picked out a location to run this test, the White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico. This test had been a huge development in the making of the bomb, and many of the scientists that had conducted this test were not sure of the consequences that it would create. Some scientists believed the bomb just wouldn't explode and the whole project would go bankrupt because the funding from the government would stop coming in with a failed test. Other scientists believed the bomb would ignite the ozone layer and cause total planetary annihilation, killing every living thing on the planet. Needless to say, nobody really knew what was about to happen. But on July 16, 1945, at 5:29 a.m., the bomb displayed massive destruction. With the successful test of the first atomic bomb, President Truman had received a lot of different advice from people in his cabinet about how to deal with Japan and force them into unconditional surrender. Secretary James Barnes had been one of the strongest advisors to President Truman, and Barnes was a strong advocate for the relentless use of the atomic bombs on Japan. Barnes had traveled with President Truman to the Potsdam Conference in Potsdam, Germany, and had been by his side the vast majority of the time that they were at the conference. The conference had been between the United Kingdom, United States, and the Soviet Union, with Churchill, Truman, and Stalin as the representatives. Most of the conference was about the surrender of Germany, but they had also mentioned Japan at the conference and came up with the Potsdam Declaration, which outlined the terms for Japan's surrender, and if they didn't meet these terms, they would face prompt and utter destruction. This was the first document that reflected flexibility on the unconditional surrender that the United States had promised to enforce, but the document was still very unforgiving. With this declaration, the United States needed to take action to force Japan to surrender, and fast. Truman had to make one of the hardest decisions that any American president has had to make and figure out how to get Japan to surrender. Truman had 4 main options to consider in ending the Japanese. Truman could use the conventional methods of bombing without nuclear power, like a continued version of the fire bombings that had hit Tokyo. It was on March 9th through 10th, 1945, the United States launched Operation Meeting House, which was the firebombing of Tokyo. It became the single most destructive bombing raid in human history, killing an estimated 100,000 people and displacing over 1 million by destroying their homes. This was an effective option, but extremely expensive, as the United States used 334 B-29s and dropped around 1,665 tons of bombs over the course of one bombing. Another option that Truman had was to replicate Operation Overlord, more commonly known as D-Day, when the Allies launched a massive invasion off the coast of France to penetrate the German defenses and get control of the coast of Normandy. But previous fighting experiences in Japan halted that idea. The Japanese had been very skilled in battle, and on Okinawa, which was when U.S. Marines invaded the island similar to D-Day on a smaller scale, the U.S. casualty rate was 35%. It wouldn't have been economically justified either, as it would have needed massive amounts of resources. Third option was to use the nuclear bomb on an unpopulated area and demonstrate the amount of destruction that the United States had without killing any civilians and forcing Japan to surrender. Truman eventually decided against this because he didn't want to risk it being a dud and having the United States embarrassed in front of their biggest enemy at the time. The last option was to use the atomic bomb on a populated area and cripple Japanese factories, destroy its urban areas, and demonstrate the destructive power that the United States was capable of. The compromise lies in the targets chosen for the bombings and the number of atomic bombs used against the Japanese. The United States wanted to target large urban areas with factories to stop Japanese production and hurt their economy, but they also wanted to inflict a lot of civilian casualties to send their message to Japan. They had gone through and looked at many Japanese cities and eventually decided on the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This was one of Truman's compromises because there were other targets that could have been destroyed, but they decided on these two cities to be the targets. The conflict lies in the effects of the atom bomb being introduced into modern warfare, and that revolution began on August 6, 1945 in Hiroshima, Japan, when the city was leveled by the most powerful bomb the world had ever seen. Dropped by the Enola Gay, the atomic bomb was known as Little Boy, and released the power of 15 kilotons of TNT upon the men, women, and children of Hiroshima. The lucky ones were instantly vaporized by the extreme temperatures the bomb released. Others died a slow death from radiation sickness that plagued the civilians of Hiroshima. The mothers, fathers, sons, and the daughters of Hiroshima were not shown mercy, and there was nothing that they could do but accept their fate. One child that lived through the bomb recalled his experience. Ada, my friend, was moving, but I could see that his back was broken, and I had to pull him up into the clear. Otto was looking at me with his left eye. His right eyeball was hanging from his face. I think he said something, but I could not make it out. Pieces of nails were stuck on his lips. The bomb was a complete success, but introduced a power that no nation or man had ever seen before, and this became the most sought-after weapon of the Cold War. When the world saw the effects of the atom bomb on Japan, regulation on the weapon immediately took place in the United States, with Truman announcing in his press release the day of the Hiroshima bombing that he recommends that the Congress of the United States consider promptly the establishment of an appropriate commission to control the production and use of atomic power in the United States. In 1946, the United States created the AEC, or the Atomic Energy Commission, to regulate the production and power of nuclear energy. In response to the massive demand for nuclear weapons, Carl Sagan and a group of other scientists published a piece entitled The Nuclear Winter, which describes the effects of global nuclear war and how the end of humanity would follow an event like that, with the sun being blocked out by fallout and killing all the crops, eventually having everyone starve or freeze to death. This became one of the biggest fears when it came to launching a nuclear weapon because the Soviet Union, United Kingdom, France, and the People's Republic of China all had nuclear weapons within 20 years of the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. As time went on after the world had seen the destruction of the bombs in Japan, more and more nuclear weapons started showing up, and they became more powerful as time went on. In 1970, the Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed by the majority of countries that had access to nuclear weapons, which had pushed the use of nuclear energy not for destruction, but for peace and cleaner energy. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had started a global change to the way that countries look at going to war. The Cold War had resulted in the two biggest contenders, the United States and Soviet Union, having over 90% of the world's nuclear weapons in their possession. War is now so reliant on the use of nuclear weapons that nations are afraid of the consequences of a global nuclear war. Mankind has to remember that with great power comes great responsibility.